It's my great honour to welcome you all.
It is a very prestigious award. It means the world to me.
They have great senses of humour.
I like to reveal parts of history to them, for I love making history come alive.
They are some of the best people that you can come across.
To help them open their hearts.
I always come back to this quote. How can we be role models to learners if we're not learners ourselves?
It's quite useful to get out of our bubbles, not our COVID ones, and sort of see what else is out there.
By sharing best practice, we can see the whole picture. We can see what really matters.
One of the biggest brains around.
It's easy to forget how much has to happen behind the front line.
As a global schools group, Cognita educates over 55,000 students across 12 countries. We're proud to be Wellbeing Partner at this year's Festival of Education, and we want to share the work that we're doing to prioritise children's well-being. This starts with a clear understanding of what well-being is. We looked at the evidence and created a simple Be Well charter that everyone can use day to day. It gives a clear definition of well-being and then focuses on the specific contributors that influence it. Discover our full Be Well charter video and other resources to use with your students and families at cognita.com.
I really try to not look at myself as just a science teacher. I feel like as a teacher, it's very important to help students grow and develop outside of your lessons. A single teacher believing in you and really believing in you. One teacher doing that can have a large impact, but if you have one or two or three all telling you that and really, really believing in it, it makes you feel like you can achieve anything in the world, honestly.
Welcome to this Festival of Education keynote session, part of the annual Festival of Education, taking place online from the 16th to the 30th of June. This year's festival is free for all teachers and educationalists across education in the UK and beyond. This has only been possible thanks to the support of our incredible partners. A huge thank you to our headline partner, Pearson, our festival partners, BBC Bitesize, Cognita and Teach First, our literary festival partner, Bloomsbury Publishing, and our organising partner, Wellington College, the home of the Festival of Education. We'd also like to thank our incredible speakers. Over 200 leading educationalists and thought leaders will be providing sessions at this year's festival. On behalf of the audience and organisers, thank you. It's time to sit back and get set for our upcoming keynote session. If you wish to ask a question during this session, please head over to our Slido page to submit questions and vote for your favourites. Enjoy this Festival of Education keynote session.
Welcome to our the first in our Temp Check panel series, where we're going to be inviting experts to explore hot topics in education and ask whether opinions have irrevocably shifted over the last year. If you're watching this live and you'd like to submit questions, you can do this via the Slido link below the YouTube video. When the first lockdown happened, there was a lot of talk about using this as an opportunity to revolutionise everything. But has the pandemic actually altered how we think our education system should run? Our three panels will be exploring how we make education policy, whether schools and colleges should prioritise well-being for its own sake, and our final panel to close the festival will ask how different schools could be in the future. Today, for the first Temp Check panel of the festival, I'm joined by four illustrious guests: Frank Norris, Debi Bailey, Natalie Perera, and John Yates. To introduce them, I'm going to give a potted history of their career and then ask each one to answer a question so that you, the audience, can get to know them a little. First, Natalie Perera. Natalie is Chief Executive of the Education Policy Institute, which she co-founded in 2016. Prior to that, Natalie worked in the Department for Education, where she led on research and policy on issues such as narrowing the disadvantage gap and school funding reform. Natalie was also seconded to the Cabinet Office for a year, where she worked in the Deputy Prime Minister's office. Natalie, to kick off, can I ask you the question, what was the hardest problem you had to solve at the Department for Education?
Good afternoon, Cath. Lovely to see you. So the hardest thing I had to, or the hardest piece of work I had in the department was trying to reform the school funding system. And for lots of you who work in schools and have done for several years, you will know that the way that schools are funded or were funded was very outdated. It didn't reflect the kind of changing need of pupils and needed to be updated. But the problem was that without any new money, anything you did would end up in some schools winning and some schools losing. Politically, there was very little appetite to do it. So we had to go through a lot of iterations with ministers. We had to do everything in a very phased way. And we had to be really careful about how we communicated what we were doing. And I'm sure there were all themes that we'll come on to in this panel.
Fantastic. Thank you, Natalie. I'm going to introduce next John Yates, who's the Executive Director of the Youth Endowment Fund, which is focused on integrating young people into society. John has had a diverse career, including as a community worker, a failed stand-up comedian, a door-to-door salesman, management consultant, and, of most interest to this debate, a special advisor to the Secretary of State for Education, former. He has also co-founded a series of charities aimed at bringing people from all backgrounds together. And he's just published a book on that topic called Fractured: Why Our Societies Are Coming Apart and How We Put Them Back Together. John, you've always played your cards close to your chest, but what I'd like to know is, you didn't come from a traditional education background, and then you found yourself catapulted into one of the most influential roles in the country. So I'm going to ask you, what was your scariest moment as special advisor to Damien Hines?
Blimey. Do you know, that's a phenomenal question. I think the sort of probably the oddest moment was sitting around the cabinet table when Theresa May and Philip Hammond, who was the Chancellor at the time, were trying to resolve a school funding dispute, which my boss was at the heart of, and watching them make slightly snide comments towards each other, and thinking, this is my one moment sat at the cabinet table, and it's this conversation that I'm here for. That was definitely relatively surreal.
Wonderful. What a great story. Thank you, John. Next, I'm going to introduce Frank Norris, who's currently advising the Northern Powerhouse Partnership on Education. Previously, as CEO, he oversaw the rapid growth of the Co-op Academies Trust, which is one of the highest performing in the country for disadvantaged students. Frank has a long history in education, including working for Ofsted for over a decade, and was awarded an MBE for education in 2019. He now holds various trustee and chair roles in education, including in Blackpool, where he's been helping to develop the town's new 10-year education strategy. Frank, the question I'd like to ask you to introduce yourself is, to what extent did working for Ofsted prepare you for running an academy trust?
Right. Well, if I'm being absolutely honest, and one of the values of being a cooperator is that you demonstrate that honesty, is I think one of the things that I expected was that actually Ofsted and its processes would ensure sort of a fair evaluation of schools when they're inspected. And I think what I found when I actually sort of jumped into the CEO role from Ofsted is that I found it I was increasingly frustrated by inspectors' inability to actually get under the skin of the context of the school. And so in a way, I think that was the most difficult transition from working within the organisation, within the inspectorate, to actually sort of being inspected by the inspectorate.
Fascinating insight. Thank you. I'm going to introduce Debi next. Debi Bailey is currently the CEO of NEAT Multi-Academy Trust, which has primary and secondary schools in areas of high disadvantage in the northeast of England. Debi also provides strategic leadership for the Research School, which is based within the trust. As a national leader of education, Debi regularly supports schools to improve outcomes for children and young people. She's a trustee for education charity Right to Succeed, and she chairs a number of committees, including the School Effectiveness Committee for Newcastle City Council. Debi, I'm going to ask you, will you tell us your proudest moment as a school leader?
Yeah, thanks, Cath. Welcome, everyone. Great to be here. I was worried about the question you were going to ask. Lots I could choose from. I think something that chimes with the theme tonight really was how as a trust we responded to that initial first lockdown. And I think what we were talking as school leaders yesterday within our trust, and one of our leaders said he felt what makes us unique as a trust is that moral leadership. And I think our response to that first lockdown for me really chimes with that. I felt like we did the right thing. We put love and care, which aren't two words you always hear when you're talking about education, at the heart of our response. So we delivered 1,300 packed lunches every day for 4 weeks. We got volunteers out, we got the community groups out, we got staff out. And not only did it help us really check in with our families, but it really helped us to see where might there have been families who were falling through the net, how are they coping with COVID? And I think I'm really proud about that. And for me, that really set the tone of how we continued to respond kind of during the next, 2-3 lockdowns that we had. So I think that's the example I'll share tonight.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Debi. And thank you for being here with us today, all of you. I'm going to move us on to the discussion. The topic is education policy by soundbites. Is there another way? And I'm hoping we can cover 3 or 4 big education soundbites of the past year. Catch up, tutoring, the concept of vulnerable children, and holiday hunger. And of course, our panelists may bring in more examples as we go along. I'm going to start with Debi. As the leader of a trust in a area of high deprivation during this time, I'd like to ask you, was the catch-up concept useful in directing head teachers' attention to what was really important during the pandemic?
I think the concept of catch-up is an interesting concept. I think for me, even the terminology, I think there's the implication that it's short term. I mean, the catch-up funding, whilst it's some additional funding, we know it's wholly inadequate. Give an example, across our trust, 6 schools, 3,500 students, we're getting £190,000 across next academic year. So whilst it's some additional funding, it's nowhere near enough. But I think as a concept, it's interesting. I think for me, it just, even the language itself implies that quick fix. And I think COVID, from my experience, has just magnified the issues that already existed, the real systemic issues, the real impact of living with poverty. And I think from my perspective and from our experience as a trust, I really think we need a long-term commitment to understanding the issues, and then a much more holistic, joined up approach to kind of, overcoming those barriers. So interesting, good to shine a spotlight, but I don't think it's gone anywhere near far enough.
Thanks, Debbie. Natalie, can we bring you in on that topic? Do you think soundbites like Catch Up are useful? Are they useful only to politicians who use them, or to get recognition for themselves, to get headlines, or do they actually have value in spreading ideas?
I think, look, you'll expect me to say, Cath, that I think the most important thing in determining policy is the evidence base, but we can't be too idealistic about these things. Sound bites can play a really important role, and we can leverage sound bites to our advantage and to secure better outcomes for young people. At the same time, sound bites or misinformation can also lead to kind of perpetuating falsehoods and misunderstandings. So on one hand, as Debbie rightly said, the concept of catch-up shone a light on the inequalities that were already in the school system and indeed beyond. And so we were able to, when I say we, I mean, everyone working in and around education, were able to use that to put pressure on the government to put some resource into supporting pupils. At the same time, other sound bites aren't always so helpful. So if we look at some of the anecdotes around grammar schools, for example, that's a really can be a popular policy amongst some voters. The evidence is fighting against sound bites and against populism. So I think there are areas in which sound bites can work well and we can use them to our advantage, and there are some times where we're fighting against them with the evidence.
Thanks, Natalie. John, I'd like to ask you, as an advisor to a minister, to an education minister, did you find that soundbites were the best way perhaps to get a minister's attention on issues that matter? And did you feel that sometimes soundbites were, as Natalie says, competing with the evidence?
So, I mean, I'm tempted to start my first answer by saying I feel the hand of history on my shoulder. But like the thing about my personal experience with soundbites is that at least the minister I worked for would have loved to avoid soundbites. I mean, he would have been delighted if you could have given him an hour with some charts, with some PowerPoint slides, to take you through his view of what was required to pull together the evidence, to lay it all out. And the difficulty is that most people aren't interested. So if I take the issue that I probably spent the most time on as a SPAD, technical education, huge amounts of money needs to be spent on technical education. I could bore everyone why we must sort it out. The model really that the British government is trying to follow in its reforms is the Dutch model. I would constantly lose arguments internally about the fact we should say, well, we're trying to do the Dutch model. And instead it would always have to be German-based technical education. It's not. We're not doing the German model, but we end up with a soundbite of minister calls for German-based technical education because most people have no idea what the Dutch system is. And if you say, well, I'd like to explain that, a sensible journalist who's not trying to be unhelpful, a sensible journalist will say, I'm not spending 100 words explaining the Dutch system in this, all I've got time for is a couple of quotes. And the core is that the average person isn't that interested in politics and isn't that interested in policy. And actually you have to find a way to boil it down. The solution to this, I think, is we've got to, as sort of people who care about change, tell lots of stories and sort of build awareness of the evidence through stories, so that then you can boil it up into a soundbite that has some resonance. But I think the problem is much deeper than if only we had politicians who liked not having soundbites. It really is. It's much more about like how do humans' brains actually work.
I love that about the story, John, building it up so that we can then, condense it into a soundbite. I think that's brilliant, and that's how we've seen policy change over time. For example, around the issue of exclusions, we've seen over the last few years, it's become quite soundbitey, whereas 5-10 years ago, people didn't understand the issues. They didn't know what AP was, for example. So you're right, if there's enough grounds work from people, the foot soldiers doing it, we can change what's on the agenda. But I'm just going to challenge you a little bit before I move on, John, because I want to ask you, who is to blame here then? You know, isn't it the minister's job to lead on policy? If you're saying that he would love to not use a soundbite, who is it that needs the soundbite? Are you blaming journalists, the general public, the chancellor because they won't give money unless it's a soundbite policy?
I prefer to blame myself. I mean, let's take an issue that I care. The charity I lead, the Youth Endowment Fund, is here to reduce deaths of children by violence. Like, that's what we're here to do. We're here to reduce the constant rising rate at the moment of knife crime. At the moment, most people have very little idea of the lives of these young people. And if I want to try and talk about that issue, the best proven evidence is something called focused deterrence. If I say to you, I want to talk about focused deterrence, I mean, I've already probably lost the audience. No one knows what I'm talking about. But if I say, we're going to copy the hard-nosed Boston cops and bring the method over here, people go, oh, that sounds kind of interesting. What I've got to do is I've got to tell stories about what happened in Boston and how actually people became safer. And then I might slip into that, the term focused deterrence. And then enough people might like the story to repeat the term. And then eventually I'll be able to go, we're going to do focused deterrence. But it's my job to tell the story. We've got to get the stories told. There's a reason why people say that people will push back against IT for 100 years now because of the Millennium Bug. It's when someone says, oh, the IT is going to blow up, people go, no, that's what they said about the Millennium Bug. And loads of things that should happen won't happen because someone can go, the Millennium Bug never happened. Things happen and they get turned into stories and then the soundbite sticks. And the answer is all of us need to get good at telling stories. And yes, ministers can be storytellers, and they should be, about things that they care about. But civil society, I believe I can play a part in that too.
Thank you, John. So tutoring is another one of those. Tutoring became quite a kind of catchy concept during the past year, and it's got an evidence base, it's got a sound evidence base. So Frank, I'm going to ask you, tutoring as a concept has managed to attract lots of government funding for schools for this catch-up concept. Is this an example of a useful catchy concept in education?
Well, it's one of those, it could be, isn't it? I mean, in effect, what this means is, like, for example, today, I think Gavin Williamson earlier today indicated there was an expectation that the tutor was going to be with 3 students. I think that's what I read. I didn't actually hear it myself, but that's what I've heard. Actually, that ties you down completely as a school leader. Actually, I can see programs where we've tried tutoring. There are a number of major tutoring organisations working in the north. I'd be surprised if there are northern schools in hard stretched areas that haven't tried them. Are we seriously saying we've got to go and use them again when actually we've found that they haven't worked particularly well in our setting? Is that really what we're saying? Or are we saying actually there are, there's other approaches that could be used? That doesn't mean to say that tutoring per se is not effective. It's just saying that in the context of where we're working, we need to take into account what people have already tried and what they've seen has worked in their setting. So when all of this started in March 2020, Henry Morrison, the director of the Northern Powers Partnership, contacted me on the phone and said, Frank, there's going to be a lockdown. What are we going to do about it? I thought, I have no idea. And I remember writing a paper that weekend saying, well, I think we probably could face a real awful situation because it was the worst case scenario. I wasn't sure how students were going to react when they came back from lockdown. So we probably need to flood it with people who know those children when they come back to school. And we need to train up, people to act as a mentor. I never thought of a tutoring option, but that was where the origins of the Northern Powers Partnership paper on mentoring went. That morphed into tutoring. And I think the issue for me around soundbites, linking this in for you, Cath, is that soundbites become sort of like silver bullets. And what we've got at the moment, we've got a silver bullet, it's the tutoring silver bullet. And actually, some people have already spent that bullet and it doesn't work. And actually what we must do is ensure that we've got schools that have got flexibility of the approach. And actually, I think we've found that the COVID has made us all realise there's a lot of very effective work that can happen when local communities come together and work out solutions themselves. And government, and I think Lord Jim O'Neill has said the DfE is the most controlling of all government departments. And I've worked in and out of that department for many years, and I have to say I agree with him. The DfE has got to trust those people who have worked their way through the pandemic, local leaders, to actually deliver what local children need using a sort of a menu of options that are available to them rather than just the tutoring option.
Thanks, Frank, really thoughtful. Debi, could I bring you in here and ask you how it was with the tutoring during this time? How have you found that? Was it useful to have that tutoring money, or would it have been better just to give the money to schools?
Yeah, thanks, Cath, sorry. And I think just picking up on Frank's point there, you know, for me, I completely agree. I think it's almost this constant change and pace of change and silver bullet. And, you know, we frantically seem to move from one policy to the next or one idea to the next. And I think, you know, the soundbite of tutoring and the national tutoring programme, yes, it's based in evidence. We have a research school, you know, yes, it might be really appropriate for some students, but it's absolutely not one size fits all. You know, certainly in a lot of our schools, I mean, we're still collapsing bubbles. You know, we still have students who haven't returned to full-time education from COVID. Therefore, at the moment, the national tutoring programme might not be the best fit for all schools and certainly all young people. You know, we've got some real issues still around mental health, you know, young people's physical health, you know, that their lack of or loss of social skills because of the lack of interaction. And I think, you know, we have put tutors in place when we felt it was appropriate. But I think for me, you know, just absolutely agreeing with Frank's point, for me, it's much more appropriate for schools and groups of schools to be able to respond to the needs within their school and their trust. And for me, that's a much more appropriate way. So useful to flag it and raise it as one of a menu of options that, you know, the evidence says can be really impactful. However, it really has to be based on the needs of the school.
Thanks, Debi. Natalie, can you broaden that out a little bit, talking about a bit wider this concept of should we trust schools to spend the money how they see fit, or should we link them to evidence-based interventions?
Sorry, Cath. It's a really knotty issue, isn't it? I think the first thing to remember is that even before the onset of the Academies programme, the school system in England was one of the most autonomous systems by international standards. So schools and head teachers particularly already had a great degree of autonomy, and indeed that has grown with the expansion of academies. And in general, I'm in favour of giving money directly to schools with maximum autonomy, but with some accountability. I think the NTP is slightly different because it is an evidence-based intervention, so it ticks that box, but it suffered from or tuition generally, suffered from not having a kind of consistent capacity. So some areas of the country, like London, it's easier to get high quality tutors. That's not the case everywhere. So the first thing the government needed to do was to build capacity and to build quality, which is why a centralised it's probably why they favoured a centralised programme. I think that is a genuine argument, but we all, you know, I can imagine that they'd sit in sanctuary buildings and also be worried about just giving the money to schools could be then used to plug school deficits. And we know that they have grown in recent years too, but obviously the department's not going to admit to creating the NTP in order to avoid schools from plugging their deficit. So I think, you know, on balance, I think probably the NTP was the right way to go. I think there's lots of opportunity for it to be matured and for it to take into account the feedback from school leaders. And I also think it shouldn't be an either or. So it shouldn't be either tuition or support for wellbeing or you know, other forms of support for pupils. And just a quick soundbite for you, Cath. When the government announced the extra catch-up funding earlier this month, we worked out in EPI that they were spending barely more in the year on pupils in England on catch-up funding than they did in a single month on the Eat Out to Help Out scheme. So there's a soundbite that you might find interesting.
Not so much a soundbite as a piece of data. We like data. That's better than a soundbite. I saw that. Sorry. I saw that Debi, you were wanting to come in there, and then also.
Sorry.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, Cath. Just really quickly, I think it was just coming back when you were asking the question. Is it that schools should have money to, to deliver their own priorities, or should they use evidence-based research like the NTP? And for me, I don't think it needs to be an either or. I think there's enough resource out there. We've got the AEF supporting schools tiered response guidance. I think there's some fantastic resource and support out there to support school leaders with, shaping their decisions through evidence-based research, but it wouldn't necessarily always take them to for example, the National Tutoring Programme. So for me, I think it's important to say it doesn't have to be an either or, but it doesn't always lead them to the decision that, for example, the NTP is the right intervention for them.
It's Frank here, Cath. I think also for those of us in the North, in some communities in the North, this feels like it's the sort of thing that you offer to your children when you want to get them through a grammar exam or an entrance exam. They've not been able to address that sort of real connection between sort of convincing communities and school leaders that this is really going to work for them. And it feels again like another intervention that is sort of driven up the motorway because it's been constructed there, and actually then expected to sort of roll into town to be delivered locally by people who haven't actually been persuaded by the argument. And I know all of this around the pandemic's required sort of very quick action and decision making, but actually we're spending quite so much money. I'm very surprised there's not been greater engagement with local communities to see what it is they actually want. Because this got ahead of itself before it started talking to communities about what their needs were. And actually talking before, as Natalie said, about, Eat Out to Help Out. I mean, all of that rides roughshod, doesn't it, really, through all of this about making sure we get good value for money. I mean, we could all go down the PPE route about good value for money, but actually this is about our investment in the next generation that's going to move us out of this pandemic. Actually, this feels like it's being done in a way as a soundbite with a silver bullet, but it's being driven up the motorway. And not enough attention given to northern communities about how this will work.
I mean, Cath, just very briefly, I mean, you mentioned the book.
Although, can I bring you in with a specific question, John? And you can say whatever you want as well. What I would like to know from you is a little challenge, but obviously say whatever you want. But if the government, my challenge there is, if the government puts more money into schools, they're going to want headlines from it, right? So is it realistic what Frank's saying, which is, let's ask communities what they want, let's find out what they want, because how are you going to get a headline from that? Because you're not going to be able to say this many million children received X, this many is going to be, this community did this. There's no big headline story from that. So is that ever going to happen, John?
I don't quite recognise that as the way it works. I mean, I don't think there was a big, the media that's come out of the catch-up work is disastrous for the government. I mean, it's really negative. I don't think it's positive at all. They've appointed someone who's highly respected and obviously given the suggestion they're going to spend a lot of money and decided they want to wait to the spending review to make those decisions. I don't think it's illegitimate to wait for the spending review. I mean, it's got issues to it, but you probably would start there rather than start off a process and then decide to leave it to the spending review. So from a media point of view, I think the thing hasn't been good, has it? I don't think a tutoring, £1 billion to tutoring is really going to cut through anywhere from a media point of view. I think people sort of shrug. Whereas if you gave, £10 billion to the schools, and you said it's, the biggest, most generous offer in Western Europe outside of the Netherlands, that probably would cut through. So I don't think it is the media. I think it's the Treasury. I mean, the Treasury will say, hang on, you're going to give this to schools. We just had a spending review. What are the schools going to do with it? And look, the Treasury's job, my problem is I have sympathy for everyone. So look, I apologise. So I feel my job is to put the counter view. The Treasury's job is to be cynical on behalf of people who pay the taxes. So there is reason to be. I mean, my question, my rhetorical question to Frank and to Debi would be: Do you critique MATs who require schools not to be fully autonomous? My view is, I suspect you don't. I suspect you think that actually it's good sometimes that MATs have certain principles and rules that schools then follow, even if one school might be in Blackpool and one school might be in Birmingham, as STARS schools are. The issue is, are the right decisions being taken in a timely way, in a consistent manner that recognises the knock-on impact on change and how hard delivery is, that takes people with you as much as you can, and that sometimes you can't, I mean, I'm sure Frank would agree with me, sometimes you can't consult. It's really hard to consult. You haven't got the time to. But if you've got a bedrock of trust, people will go with you. And so I think that the issue is really, are the right people making the decisions on the right information? And so I don't, it is like a really, if I wanted to be popular, I'd say school leaders know best, always trust them, and teachers always know everything, especially when they're first in the classroom, just out of training. It's just not true. And if you empower a great teacher and a great head teacher and a great MAT leader, they'll do great things, and they'll do much better things than anyone else. If you empower someone who doesn't really know what they're doing, or doesn't always make the best decisions, it won't work so well. But you wouldn't have someone on the panel who makes bad decisions. So, and if they did, they wouldn't know. So that's the tension that you've got to sort of wrestle with.
I'm going to ask Frank to come in here on the question of whether school leaders do know best. But first, I want to challenge something quickly that you said, John, which was about the Treasury. You know, if we gave all this money to schools, that would be a great headline. I'm going to challenge that because the Treasury surely, and the government surely, likes one-off pots because it gets them new headlines every time they announce it. And that money only lasts for a year or for a certain amount of time. And next year they can announce something else that's a big policy. Whereas if you increase school funding, you get one headline and then you have to pay for it every year and no one thanks you the next year.
There's definitely something in the ongoing recurring cost, but that's a Treasury, that is back to the Treasury again. But if you want to win the sort of, here's a pot of money, you don't need to spend £1 billion. Just spend 5 million. Or spend $1 million. Like the average member of the public, including, you know, most people who I respect hugely, don't really, listening to the radio, notice the difference between 5 million and $1 billion. And so if you just want a headline, just announce a £5 billion pot. And so I don't think that's what's driving it when it's this amount of money. I think it's the question of control that's driving it, and trust. And my only point really is, you just shouldn't trust everyone 100% on everything, but you do want the right people making the decisions.
I would challenge that slightly about the value of money, because you're going to get a Schools Week front page next week, which is like a pencil for every classroom. So someone's doing the calculation. So thank goodness for education journalists, shall I say. Frank, I was going to bring you in that question of, do school leaders know best how to spend government money on education?
Well, picking up on the point John made, which I think is eminently sensible, I agree with him on that. But actually, we can't have these mixed messages. If we've got, what is it, in the high 80% of schools judged to be effective, we're actually saying that we're stopping the system from actually giving those schools the funds that they need, simply because we've got concerns about a much smaller proportion of schools that we don't deem to be effective. And actually, the whole of this discussion, no one has spoken about, well, where has the pandemic hit the most? You know, what this government is very keen on doing is offering bits to everybody, because actually everybody wants a bit of the cake. But actually, for those in the north, some of those communities are suffering now, seriously suffering. We've got bubbles closing all over the place. And actually what we've got is a system that really isn't giving the funding to the hardest hit areas. And picking up on just a broader issue, you know, this has been going on for a while, because actually pupil premium funding was a great innovation. But actually we've found now that actually if children that are long-term disadvantaged on, you know, receiving pupil premium funding for a long period of time, that's the sharpest end of it. And I suspect that's the end where children have suffered the most in the pandemic. So, you know, if we are short of funding, then really we've got to be thinking about, well, no, we've got to be bold and say, no, not everybody can have it. Communities have been hit harder here. We need to give them more of that funding. And I think the long-term disadvantage free pupil premium is the way to do it.
So was holiday hunger a better concept then? So that was brought up by a footballer to get going to a lot of traction on social media. It was obviously a very popular concept among people. Was that the right place to direct that funds towards children, poor children on pupil premium who didn't potentially have the money to eat during the holidays? Was that a good decision, Debi?
Again, for me, I feel like a broken record. I think holiday hunger is something that's been in existence for quite a long time. And I think, hats off to Marcus Rashford, great piece of work. But the frustration is schools and school leaders have been, sharing those concerns and those frustrations and that real lack of funding and real recognition of the issues for a significant amount of time. So I think for me, it was a real frustration that those messages hadn't, been understood by government far sooner, and it took a professional footballer to shine the light on an issue that we'd been experiencing for a significant amount of time.
Yeah, thank you. Natalie, did you want to come in on that?
Yeah, thank you. I agree with Debbie. Holiday hunger has been a long-standing issue, but that children going hungry during holiday terms and then feeding them isn't addressing the root of the problem. It's a sticking plaster. And actually, what we've been calling for, what many people have been calling for, is a proper review of child poverty. And that includes looking at the welfare system, the housing system, and the unemployment rights too. Because unless we can get all that right, and early intervention, unless we get all of that right, then we are just going to keep having a continuum of sticking plasters. And again, huge credit to Marcus Rashford for what he achieved and for shining that light. But really, we need to have a more systemic approach to tackling child poverty.
I think it comes back again to soundbites, right? I mean, what was that soundbite that George Osborne used as he cut the welfare budget? It was a slightly long bite, but it was, we're here to help alarm clock Britain. People who are getting up in the morning while the person next to them is lying in bed. That cut through. And it's not representative of reality, is it? I mean, we know that so many of the people who are struggling financially are going to work and then potentially they're in two jobs. So, I don't think you can say to that, therefore, let's ban sound bites. But we've got to try and tell better stories. And I think, a part of this is also, though, we've got to give people experience. I mean, I come back to my underlying passion with all of these things. We've got to do something about the fact that it's really easy in this country to grow up, go to school, go to work, and never have a friend who struggles financially. So actually, you've got to take the public on such a long journey. It shouldn't surprise us that the places that do invest properly in welfare are places where children mix at school with people who are struggling financially, because then you understand, and it's not something for them, those people. It's something for us. And I think until we can give people, no soundbite would have convinced people that we should cut school funding, because everyone knows someone who's got kids at school, or everyone knows someone who's a teacher. Very easy to cut FE. Because people don't all know people who are using FE. Until we do something about the lack of connection in the country, I think it's very hard to get the stories through, and then the sound bites will never be the right sound bites.
Well, you've opened up a whole other question we don't have time for now, which is makes it, thinking of grammar schools and selective schools and private schools and all kinds of institutions which separate children from a young age. But I don't think, sadly, we've got time to get into those right now. So I'm going to ask each of our panelists to wrap up. My question is, but if you want to say something else to wrap up, then override me. My question is, has the temperature changed on this issue? So education policy by sound bites, good or bad, has the pandemic changed how we think about this question? If you want to give another final closing statement, as long as it's short, then go ahead. Frank, I'll start with you.
I was optimistic, but actually I feel concerned that we're led by politicians who want us to get back to where we were. And that is a real missed opportunity, because there are, as we have said today, some fundamental problems inherent in the system, and we need to actually address those. So I'm less optimistic as time goes by.
Thanks, Frank. Debbie, do you want to wrap up?
Yeah, I couldn't have said it better, Frank. For me, exactly the same. I feel this was a real opportunity and a real, we could have seen some real sea change, some real systemic changes, and that's what it's going to take. So for me, I'm less hopeful, and I think sound bites for me are quick fixes, and this is not what we need now. We need that long-term commitment.
Thank you. Natalie?
So my view hasn't changed. I still think that evidence should be the driver for good policy making and better outcomes. But I think we should not consider soundbites to be a dirty word, and they can be helpful to us in trying to secure those outcomes.
Thank you. And the final word goes to John.
Well, I've literally just received a text inviting me to my second vaccination as we're speaking. So I sort of feel like the soundbite to end on might be that the night is always darkest before the dawn.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to all of our panelists today. It's been a really interesting discussion. I've really enjoyed it, and I hope that you have too, the audience. Please do keep following Education Fest on Twitter and on our YouTube channel. And we'll see you at the next debate next week. Thank you.
It's my great honour to welcome you all.
It is a very prestigious award. It means the world to me.
They have great senses of humour.
I like to reveal parts of history to them, for I love making history come alive.
They are some of the best people that you can come across.
To help them open their hearts.
I always come back to this quote. How can we be role models to learners if we're not learners ourselves?
It's quite useful to get out of our bubbles, not our COVID ones, and sort of see what else is out there.
By sharing best practice, we can see the whole picture. We can see what really matters.
One of the biggest brains around.
It's easy to forget how much has to happen behind the front line.
As a global schools group, Cognita educates over 55,000 students across 12 countries. We're proud to be Wellbeing Partner at this year's Festival of Education, and we want to share the work that we're doing to prioritise children's well-being. This starts with a clear understanding of what well-being is. We looked at the evidence and created a simple Be Well charter that everyone can use day to day. It gives a clear definition of well-being and then focuses on the specific contributors that influence it. Discover our full Be Well charter video and other resources to use with your students and families at cognita.com.
I really try to not look at myself as just a science teacher. I feel like as a teacher, it's very important to help students grow and develop outside of your lessons. A single teacher believing in you and really believing in you. One teacher doing that can have a large impact, but if you have one or two or three all telling you that and really, really believing in it, it makes you feel like you can achieve anything in the world, honestly.